The first thing Adrian Mercer did was smile at the donors. The second was point at me and call me a fraud. We were standing beneath the glass roof of the Calder City Museum's East Gallery, surrounded by 12 paintings my mother had made and 100 people who had paid to be the first to see them. Except the labels did not carry my mother's name. They called the paintings newly authenticated late works by Julian Cross, the most valuable artist our city had ever produced. Adrian held the microphone as if it belonged in his hand. For 9 years I had used that calm smile to soothe nervous lenders, charm suspicious trustees, and make rich people feel that giving him money was an act of courage. Ms. Vale's allegations are not scholarship, he said. They are a grieving daughter's attempt to manufacture an inheritance. The room went so quiet that I heard the champagne bubbles breaking in a glass beside me. Security had already moved toward the gallery doors. My museum identification had stopped working that morning, but Adrian had invited me to the donor preview anyway. Now I understood why. He wanted witnesses when he destroyed my credibility. The photographs are dated, I said. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to. The treatment maps are dated. Your own laboratory tested the signature pigment. Adrian tilted his head with an expression I once mistook for patience. Materials can be planted. Records can be altered, especially by someone with unsupervised access to the objects. That was the trap. I had conserved the paintings before they entered the museum. Every mark that proved they were my mother's could be recast as a mark I had planted. One guard touched my elbow. Across the gallery, Dr. Naomi Chan stood beside a portable ultraviolet lamp. She was the independent conservator I had asked the board to bring in. Adrian had treated her presence as a courtesy. He had forgotten that ultraviolet light does not care who signs its paper. Naomi looked at the board chair. Celia Ward gave the smallest nod. The chandeliers went dark. For one breath, the gallery disappeared. Then Naomi switched on the UV lamp, and the largest painting began to glow in layers. Old natural resin fluoresced a cloudy green. New varnish appeared as 12 dark islands. Across the lower corner, where the name Julian Cross sat in immaculate black, a second set of letters emerged beneath it like bones under skin. Adrian stopped smiling. What appeared under that light had begun 11 months earlier, on the morning after my mother died. My mother's name was Isabel Vale. She painted in a narrow back room behind the sign shop where she worked for 32 years. By day, she lettered grocery windows, delivery vans, theater boards, and retirement banners. At night, she painted the people who passed through the bus station across the street. She never called herself an artist in public. The word felt too grand to her, like a coat borrowed from somebody richer. If I called her paintings beautiful, she would wipe her brush on a rag and say, "Beautiful is useful only when it tells the truth." The 12 canvases were the work she protected most carefully. They showed travelers waiting between departures, a nurse asleep on a suitcase, a father tying a child's shoe, a woman holding flowers meant for someone who never arrived. The paint was quiet, but the waiting inside it was not. When I was 16, I asked why she never exhibited them. She said the city had enough pictures made by people who knew how to enter the right rooms. Then she changed the subject. I entered those rooms for her. I studied conservation because I loved the moment when dirt lifted from a surface and an old decision became visible again. I learned chemistry, microscopy, documentation, and the discipline of touching nothing until I understood what every layer meant. Adrian hired me at 29 and told me precision was a form of courage. For years, he was the person I called when I needed professional advice. He recommended me for training. He corrected my reports without humiliating me. When my mother became ill, he let me adjust my schedule. I believed loyalty meant remembering every kindness and paying it back with silence when the giver disappointed you. After the funeral, I unlocked my mother's workroom and found the 12 canvases wrapped in cotton sheets. A leaking pipe had raised the humidity. 2 paintings showed blanching in the varnish, and 1 stretcher had begun to warp. I brought in my camera, hygrometer, raking lights, and condition forms. Grief made ordinary decisions feel impossible, so I did what training had taught me. I documented. I photographed every front and back with a scale and color target. I mapped cracks, old fills, stains, and tiny losses. Behind each lower right canvas key, I found a short diagonal mark in blue pencil. My mother used that pencil for sign layouts. I wrote it down because conservators write down details that seem meaningless. Meaning often arrives later. Adrian visited the shop 3 days after the funeral. He stood among the canvases for nearly an hour. I had never seen him study my mother's work with such attention. "Elena," he said, "these should not be sitting beside a leaking pipe. Let the museum store them while you settle the estate. No fee."
Proper climata control.
I told him they were unsigned and had no formal provenance beyond my word. "Your documentation is more than most families have," he said. "We can inventory them as estate property. Storage is not accession. You keep ownership." He sounded protective. More than that, he sounded impressed. I had spent my adult life wanting someone from his world to look at my mother's paintings and see what I saw. When he offered museum storage, it felt like belated recognition. I signed a temporary custody receipt for 12 works attributed to Isabel Vale, estate of Isabel Vale. Ruth Bell had designed. 2 months later, he called me into his office. On his desk lay a catalogue raisonné for Julian Cross. Cross was a regional modernist who died in 1987. His auction prices had tripled after a retrospective in London. Calder owned 7 undisputed works by him, and Adrian had spent years trying to make our museum the center of Cross scholarship. He turned the catalogue toward me and placed a photograph of one of my mother's canvases beside a Cross painting from 1962. "Look at the compressed perspective," he said. "The mineral green. The way the hands are simplified." I looked. There were similarities, the way there are similarities between many painters who learned from the same books and saw the same exhibitions. But I had watched my mother build those figures. I knew the green came from discounted paint she bought from a closing theater workshop. "It is my mother's," I said. Adrian folded his hands. "Of course that is how it came to you. The question is whether Isabel made it." He proposed that Cross might have painted the works privately, then left them with my mother for safekeeping. Perhaps they had known each other. Perhaps she had stretched or repaired them. He called it a hypothesis, but his eyes already held the shine they got when he imagined a press conference. "Cross died before my mother rented that shop," I said. "I remember her painting 6 of these." "Memory is sincere," he replied. "It is not always reliable." I should have ended the conversation there. Instead, because he was my director and former mentor, I agreed to examine the works with him. I told myself evidence would settle it. For the next month, I worked evenings without overtime because Adrian called the project confidential scholarship. I took infrared images, examined fibers, and sampled varnish from areas already damaged. Every result pointed toward my mother. The ground layers varied because she reused materials. The linen on 8 canvases came from the same supplier whose invoices I had found in her shop. The underdrawing had her habit of correcting shoulders with a looped line. Nothing connected the works to Cross except visual resemblance. Adrian treated every negative result as an invitation to search again. One Friday, I arrived to find the paintings moved from conservation storage to a restricted project room. My badge still opened it, but a new camera had been mounted above the door. Martin Say, a private restorer I knew only by reputation, was cleaning brushes at my sink. "Presentation work," he said when I asked why he was there. The canvases looked glossier. Martin said Adrian had approved a saturating varnish to prepare them for photography. I told him no treatment had been approved by the owner, meaning me. He shrugged and showed me a work order signed by the director. I went upstairs. Adrian was on a donor call. He covered the receiver and said, "We are stabilizing institutional property." "They are not institutional property." His gaze cooled. "Then perhaps you should decide whether you are speaking as an employee or as a claimant." I asked the registrar for the custody file. She said Adrian had transferred it to his office for review. I opened my own copy at home and noticed something I had missed. The registrar's carbon impression was faint, but the museum's object numbers had been written beside each title after I signed. Temporary custody objects were not supposed to receive permanent accession numbers. I emailed Adrian and copied the registrar. I asked him to confirm that the works remained estate property, and that no further treatment would occur without written authorization. He answered the next afternoon with 3 lines. The attribution was under active review. The museum asserted a custodial and research interest. All communication should remain confidential to protect the integrity of the process. 2 weeks later, the museum announced the discovery of 12 unknown late works by Julian Cross. I learned from a notification on my phone. The press release described the paintings as having emerged from a private local collection. It thanked Adrian for recognizing Cross's hand and announced a major exhibition called The Waiting Years. It did not mention Isabel. It did not mention me. At the bottom was a quote from Celia Ward celebrating a $28 million donor commitment for a new Cross Center, contingent on authentication. I read the release twice in the conservation lab while the ventilation system hummed above me. Then I walked to the project room. For the first time, each painting carried a black signature in the lower right corner. A cross. The letters were narrow, controlled, and wrong. I leaned close without touching. The black sat above the varnish boundary in places. Even in ordinary light, I could see a slight difference in gloss around the letters. My mother had not signed those paintings. Cross had not signed them either. I reached for the camera cabinet. It was locked. Lucas Reed, our lab technician, came in carrying sample trays. When he saw my face, he set them down. Who had access last weekend? I asked. He looked toward the ceiling camera. I can't discuss the project. Lucas, somebody added signatures to 12 paintings owned by my mother's estate. His mouth tightened. You need to talk to Adrian. I did, and Adrian did not deny that the signatures were new. He called them reintegrations. Infrared showed remnants consistent with Cross's monogram, he said. Martin reconstructed what abrasion removed. This is accepted practice when properly documented. Show me the infrared files. When the review is complete. I made the infrared files. There were no monograms. He stood and closed his office door. Be very careful, Elena. You are emotionally involved, and you performed undocumented treatment before these works entered our custody. If questions arise about altered surfaces, you are the person with motive and opportunity. I stared at the man who had once told me precision was courage. He had not forgotten my documentation. He was counting on it. My access, my treatment, and my inheritance gave him a ready-made suspect. Why are you doing this? I asked. For a moment, the polished director disappeared. I saw exhaustion under his eyes. Do you know what happens if the expansion pledge fails? He said. We lose staff. We lose the education wing. We become a provincial museum that sends its best work elsewhere. These paintings can secure this institution for a generation. Your mother remains part of their history. As what? The woman whose name you erased. As a custodian. Perhaps an assistant. History is rarely as simple as ownership. His logic was monstrous because each piece sounded administrative. A compromised attribution became institutional survival. Theft became stewardship. My mother's disappearance became nuance. I told him I wanted the paintings returned. He said the museum would not release objects subject to a disputed ownership and attribution review. When I returned to the lab, my access to the project drive had been removed. At home that night, I opened the external drive where I kept personal backups. Museum policy prohibited copying restricted research, so I had never taken Adrian's project files. But the baseline photographs belonged to the estate, and I had saved the originals before uploading them. Their metadata showed the date, camera body, lens, exposure, and sequence. Every lower right corner was clean. No signature. No abrasion shaped like a signature. No trace waiting to be reconstructed. I also had my handwritten treatment maps. My mother used to tease me for keeping paper in a digital profession. Now the pages carried coffee rings, pressure marks, and dates that could not be recreated by changing a computer clock. I compared them with the photographs from the press release. The new signatures sat directly over 3 tiny losses I had mapped. Whoever painted the letters had filled those losses first, then varnished selectively around them. That discovery should have made me feel powerful. Instead, it frightened me. Evidence matters only if people trust the person presenting it, and Adrian had begun damaging that trust before I knew there was a fight. The next morning, Human Resources asked me to attend a meeting. Adrian was there with Museum Council. A printed incident report said I had accessed restricted objects after my authority was revoked. Another page suggested I had failed to disclose a financial interest while performing conservation analysis. They belonged to my mother's estate before I analyzed them, I said. Everyone knew that. Counsel adjusted his glasses. The issue is whether your dual role compromised the research. Adrian looked regretful. He was excellent at looking regretful when somebody else was about to pay for his decision. They placed me on administrative leave. I had to surrender my badge, keys, and laboratory notebook pending review. I refused to hand over the notebook because it contained estate observations made before museum custody. Counsel threatened an injunction. I asked for the demand in writing. That small sentence changed something in the room. Until then, I had been reacting as Adrian's former student, trying to persuade him to become the man I thought he was. Asking for the demand in writing made me act like a conservator protecting a record. I left through the staff entrance carrying one cardboard box. Colleagues looked away. Lucas stood at the end of the corridor with a tray in his hands. He did not speak, but his eyes dropped to the box and then to the security camera. He was afraid. For 3 days I did almost nothing useful. I answered calls from journalists with no comment. I slept on my mother's sofa in the sign shop because my apartment felt too silent. News articles repeated the museum's language. One described me as an aspiring painter whose claim could dramatically increase the value of her inheritance. Another quoted an unnamed source saying I had conducted unsupervised cleaning. My career depended on confidence. Owners entrusted conservators with irreplaceable objects. A rumor of undocumented treatment could close every door without any formal finding. On the 4th morning, a courier delivered a legal notice. It ordered me to stop asserting that the paintings were by Isabel Vale and accused me of interfering with contractual donor relations. Attached was a photocopy of an accession card listing the objects as anonymous works transferred from the Vale collection in 1986. I was 6 years old in 1986. My mother had not yet painted 9 of them. The false date was not a mistake. It created a bridge to Julian Cross, who was alive until 1987. I laid my temporary custody receipt beside the accession card. The typeface on the card looked old, but the object numbers matched the modern database. The signature attributed to a registrar named Helen Moss seemed plausible. I needed somebody who knew how those cards had actually been made. That was when I called Ruth Bell. Ruth had retired 3 years earlier after 4 decades as Calder's registrar. She answered on the 7th ring and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me to read the accession number. That series wasn't used in 1986, she said. It began after the flood in '94. She told me not to email the card. We met at a bakery across from the old courthouse. Ruth arrived with a magnifying glass, a notebook, and the expression of a woman who had spent her career catching other people's casual errors. She examined the photocopy for 10 minutes. Helen never typed cards, she said. She had arthritis and wrote in block capitals. This signature was copied from annual reports. And this isn't our old stock. The crop marks are wrong. Can you prove it? A fake record usually has a parent. Find the thing it was copied from, and the choices become visible. Ruth still had permission to consult the museum's historical archive, but she would not remove or photograph records in violation of policy. She agreed to search the public finding aids and request the relevant boxes as an independent researcher. Her boundaries slowed us down, which was exactly why I trusted her. Meanwhile, I needed scientific review that could not be dismissed as my work. I contacted Naomi Chan, who ran a private conservation laboratory 2 cities away, and served on a national ethics committee. I knew her professionally but not personally. I sent only the temporary receipt, 5 representative baseline images, and the public exhibition photographs. She called within an hour. The signature gloss is inconsistent, she said. That is an observation, not a conclusion. I would need the objects in full resolution files. The museum will say I manipulated the originals. Then do not send me files alone. Preserve the drive. Hash the files. Make forensic copies through counsel. Document every transfer. I wanted her to tell me she believed me. Instead, she told me how to build evidence that did not require belief. I hired an attorney named Priya Noland using money my mother had left for repairs to the sign shop. Priya specialized in art ownership disputes and had no patience for dramatic language. She read the legal notice, then asked the question I had avoided. What outcome do you want if you cannot keep your museum job? The paintings back. My mother's name restored. And Mercer punished? I thought of the cardboard box, the turned faces, and his calm voice calling me compromised. I want the record to be accurate, I said. Priya nodded. Good. Records are achievable. Punishment belongs to processes we do not control. Under her direction, we made a forensic image of my external drive. A technician calculated cryptographic hashes for every photograph. Priya sealed my paper notes in evidence sleeves after making certified copies. We requested the museum preserve access logs, security video, treatment records, samples, emails, and all versions of the accession data. The museum responded that our request was overbroad. 2 days later, the shared conservation system suffered what staff were told was a synchronization error. Several project folders disappeared. I learned that from Lucas. He called from a prepaid number at 11 at night. His whisper made me sit upright. I ran the signature sample, he said. When? 3 weeks before the announcement. Adrian brought me a flake and labeled it unknown black retouching. The binder contains acrylic copolymer. The pigment includes PBK11 with a dispersant formulation. Our reference lab dates after 2004. It cannot be an original cross-signature. Where is the report? He made me rerun it. Same result. Then he said the sample location was contaminated and told me to remove the report from the case file. I closed my eyes. Did you? I removed the PDF. The instrument stores raw runs separately. I don't know if he knows. Do not access anything for me, I said. Do not send me a file. Write down what happened while you remember it. Call your own lawyer and follow the preservation notice. He sounded surprised. Maybe he expected me to ask him to become a thief on my behalf.
Elena, I'm sorry.
Then protect the original evidence. After we hung up, I wrote a dated memo of the conversation and sent it to Priya. For the first time, we had a test conducted inside Adrian's own lab before I raised a public accusation. But Lucas was vulnerable. If we exposed him too soon, Adrian could call him incompetent or claim he had acted with me. The next development came from something less dramatic: canvas. While clearing my mother's shop, I found a folder of supplier invoices arranged by year. 8 paintings used a fine Belgian linen with an orange manufacturer stripe at the selvage. The invoices showed my mother buying rolls from Varga Art Materials in 1991, 1996, and 2003. Each invoice carried batch numbers. Julian Cross had died 4 years before the first purchase. I called Varga. The company had closed its retail operation, but the founder's daughter maintained business archives for tax and provenance inquiries. Priya sent a formal request. The reply confirmed the batch numbers, sale dates, purchaser, and shipping address. Better still, the weave pattern had changed after a loom replacement in 1990. The disputed canvases carried the later weave. Adrian's public catalog essay claimed Cross had stretched the canvases around 1984. We sent the supplier statement to the museum board with a request for independent examination. Celia Ward replied through counsel. She said the board took provenance seriously, but would not interrupt an exhibition based on materials supplied by an interested claimant. Then the museum moved the donor preview forward by 3 weeks. Adrian understood momentum. Once donors stood beneath banners, once critics published reviews, and once the new wing appeared in architectural renderings, correcting the attribution would feel like tearing down something real. He was turning speed into evidence. Ruth called the same afternoon. I found the parent, she said. The archive held a legitimate 1986 loan card for 3 anonymous works from the Vale collection, Vielle. The fake accession card copied its wording, registrar signature, and date, then changed Vale to Vale. Whoever made it had selected an old record whose owner name resembled mine. But Ruth had found something else in a box of unresolved deposits from the current year. The original temporary accession worksheet for my mother's 12 paintings. Someone had torn it from the active binder and filed it among abandoned records. In the margin, Adrian had written, "Temporary attribution pending review. Possible IV group.
Elena Vale."
He had acknowledged her authorship before he developed the cross theory. Ruth could not remove the card. She requested a certified archive scan through normal procedure. The next morning, The request was denied because the box had been reclassified as part of ongoing litigation. He knows, I said. Of course he knows, Ruth replied. The question is whether he can make the card disappear without making its disappearance another fact. Ruth had signed the archive request log. A reading room camera recorded her opening the box. The archivist had entered the item description before the restriction arrived. Process again was slower than anger and stronger than it. Priya filed for a narrow preservation order. We did not ask a court to decide authorship. We asked it to prevent alteration, movement, treatment, or destruction of the 12 paintings and their records until an independent inspection could occur. The museum opposed us, arguing that routine exhibition preparation would be disrupted. At the hearing, museum counsel produced declarations suggesting my mother had worked as a cleaner at Cross's studio in the 1980s. The claim came from an unsigned interview summary. My mother had never cleaned his studio. During those years, she worked mornings at a bakery and evenings at the sign shop. I had tax forms and union records. The judge did not decide who was lying. She ordered the museum to preserve the objects and samples and directed both sides to propose an independent examiner. Adrian proposed 2 scholars who had written catalog essays for Calder. Priya proposed Naomi. The board resisted until Celia received a private message from one of the lead donors. He did not want his name attached to a disputed discovery. 3 days later, Naomi was approved. Her examination was scheduled for the Monday before the donor preview. I was allowed to attend as the estate representative, but I could not touch the paintings. Walking back into the conservation laboratory without a badge felt like returning to a home after strangers had changed the locks. Naomi arrived with her own calibrated UV source, infrared camera, microscope, sample containers, and 2 assistants. Every device was logged. Every seal was photographed. Museum counsel watched from behind a glass partition. The paintings told the story slowly. Under raking light, the signature area showed shallow fills crossing older cracks. Under ultraviolet illumination, broad-aged varnish fluoresced green while newer resin remained dark around each signature. Infrared imaging revealed no buried cross monogram. Instead, on 4 canvases, it showed fragments of block lettering beneath overpaint near the stretcher edge. My mother's sign painter hand. Naomi did not announce conclusions. She dictated observations. Localized non-fluorescent coating extending approximately 18 millimeters beyond black inscription. Retouching bridges age crackle and therefore postdates crack formation. No infrared evidence supporting reconstructed monogram. On the 7th painting, she asked for the baseline image from my sealed drive. The blue pencil mark behind the lower right key aligned with the photograph down to a tiny fork where the pencil caught the wood grain. The key in front of us carried the same mark, partly covered by a recently applied inventory label. That mark proved the physical canvas was the one I had documented. It did not, by itself, prove my mother painted it. But it connected my untouched baseline photographs to the museum object beyond reasonable dispute. Naomi sampled a signature where a loose flake made sampling minimally invasive. Lucas observed from the instrument station, pale and silent. When the result loaded, he looked at Adrian through the glass. The modern acrylic binder appeared again. Adrian requested that Naomi note possible contamination from my earlier treatment. Naomi asked me on the record whether I had ever used acrylic resin on the paintings. No. My materials list is in the sealed treatment map. Isinglass for 2 lifting flakes. No varnish application. No retouching. She examined the maps and baseline files. The signature sample came from an area I had documented as untouched. The proposed contamination pathway is not supported by the records reviewed, she dictated. Adrian left the lab before the examination ended. Naomi's preliminary findings should have stopped the preview. Instead, the board called them inconclusive. Celia explained the decision to Priya in a conference call. UV fluorescence established later intervention, she said, but not who made the paintings. Modern signature material could reflect an overzealous restoration rather than intentional fraud. The donor event would proceed without a final authentication statement. That sounded cautious until I saw the revised invitation. The title still read Julian Cross. The waiting years. Adrian was still scheduled to announce the expansion pledge. The The institution had found a way to call certainty premature while selling certainty to donors. I asked Naomi why her evidence was not enough. Because evidence answers specific questions, she said. We can show the signatures are recent. We can show the surface was altered after your photographs. We still need to connect the alterations to an instruction and establish authorship independently. I hated the restraint in her answer. I also knew it was the difference between investigation and accusation. I sat on the floor before opening it. At that time, Adrian was a junior curator trying to build a program around overlooked local artists. I had been 14 and knew only that a man from the museum had visited the shop twice. My mother told me he wanted signs for an event. The letter told a different story. Dear Isabel, it began. The waiting room paintings have remained with me since our conversation. Their restraint is extraordinary. I believe a focused presentation of 6 works would make the strongest introduction. He had known her paintings for more than 20 years. The next letters charted a small hope. Adrian asked for biographies, dimensions, and prices. My mother answered on carbon paper, apologizing for her English even though her English was precise. She described watching Travelers because people revealed their truest posture while waiting for news. Then the tone changed. A donor who underwrote the regional gallery objected to dedicating space to an unknown sign painter. Adrian proposed including 1 work in a group exhibition. Later, he postponed even that. My mother's final letter was only 4 sentences. You asked me to be patient because the museum moves slowly. I have been patient in rooms where my name became smaller each time it was spoken. Please return the 6 paintings. I would rather keep them unseen than teach my daughter that permission is the same as worth. Beneath her signature she added, the blue mark behind each lower key is mine, in case labels are ever lost again. The last line explained the marks. She had used them as a private inventory system, after Adrian's office misplaced labels during that first proposed show. There was one final note from him confirming the return of 6 works. He apologized and promised the museum would be ready for her one day. That promise had become a theft. Adrian had not mistaken my mother's work for crosses. He had recognized it the moment he entered the shop after her funeral. I wanted to publish the letters immediately. Priya stopped me. First, we authenticated the paper and handwriting through independent comparison. We documented where the tin had been found and asked the estate executor, my Aunt Sophia, to witness the inventory. Then Priya disclosed copies to Museum Council under the preservation case. Within hours, Adrian's lawyer replied that the correspondence proved only that Adrian had once considered exhibiting similar works. He suggested my mother might have shown him copies or imitations of cross. The explanation was weak, but it revealed his strategy. He would reinterpret every object separately so no single fact became decisive. We needed the facts to connect. Ruth built the chronology. In 2002, Adrian handled 6 named Isabel Vale paintings. 11 months ago, he accepted 12 estate paintings under temporary custody and wrote her initials on the worksheet. 7 months ago, he moved them into restricted storage. 6 months ago, Martin began after-hours access. 5 months ago, Lucas tested modern signature material. 2 months ago, the museum created a backdated accession claim and announced cross-attribution. The sequence converted ambiguity into intent. Security logs could confirm Martin's visits, but the museum had produced only a summary stating that authorized contractors entered during normal operations. Priya pressed for raw data under the preservation order. The exported log showed Martin's badge opening the conservation corridor 14 times between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Adrian's executive badge entered on 11 of those nights. On 3 nights, the project room camera went offline for maintenance. Martin had signed a confidentiality agreement, and at first he refused to speak. Priya contacted his attorney with one careful message. The physical evidence would establish what work occurred. Cooperation could establish who ordered it. He asked for protection from professional retaliation and assurance that his statement would go to the board, not the press. Celia agreed because by then the donor committee had begun asking questions she could not answer. Martin's account arrived as a sworn declaration the morning of the preview. Adrian had hired him for what the work orders called presentation corrections. First, Martin applied a reversible isolating varnish. Then Adrian gave him infrared printouts with proposed signature shapes drawn in red. Martin filled old abrasions and added the signatures in conservation paint. He said Adrian represented the works as museum property with documented lost inscriptions. When Martin questioned why all 12 required reconstruction, Adrian told him authentication scholars had approved the decision. No scholars had approved it. Martin admitted he should have demanded the ownership file and written rationale. He did not pretend he had been powerless. He had accepted an unusual instruction because Calder paid well and Adrian controlled future contracts. The statement connected Adrian to the alterations, but the board still had to decide how to handle the event already assembling around us. Caterers were setting tables. Donors had flown in. Financial reporters were waiting for the expansion announcement. Celia called me at noon. "We will postpone the cross-attribution language," she said. "The paintings can be presented as works under study. The wall labels already call them cross. They can be covered." "And Adrian?" There was a pause. "He remains director unless the board acts. We need a formal meeting." "He manufactured evidence." "I understand your position." "It is not a position." Celia exhaled. "Elena, institutions have procedures precisely because facts arrive in conflict. I looked around my mother's shop at the hand-painted alphabets pinned to the wall. Then use the procedure before he uses your donors as a shield." She asked what I intended to do. I said I would attend the preview because the museum had sent me an invitation before suspending me. I would stand quietly unless Adrian made a false statement about me or the paintings. That was true but incomplete. Naomi would bring her equipment under the board's examination authority. Ruth would bring certified copies of the archive request log and accession records. Lucas had retained counsel and agreed to confirm the suppressed test if asked. Martin's declaration was already in Celia's inbox. We were not planning a theatrical ambush. We were ensuring that if Adrian chose public deception, the evidence would be present in the same room. Before the doors opened, I walked through the East Gallery. Staff had covered the artist names on the labels with cream cards, but the exhibition title still towered above the entrance. The paintings looked unlike they had in my mother's workroom. The frames were expensive. The lighting made every red deeper. Recognition and theft occupied the same walls. I stopped before a painting of an old woman holding a paper bag of oranges. My mother had painted it after we missed a bus during a winter storm. The woman shared 2 oranges with us and said sweetness lasted longer when divided. For months, I had thought justice meant making Adrian admit what he had done. Standing there, I understood confession would give him one more central role. The paintings did not need his admission. They needed a truthful record and freedom from his control. Guests entered at 6. Adrian moved among them as if nothing had changed. He wore a dark blue suit and the small silver pin reserved for museum directors at official events. When he saw me, he did not appear surprised. "You should not be here," he said quietly. "My invitation was never withdrawn. This will not restore your position. I am not here for my position." His eyes moved to Naomi's equipment case. "You have mistaken technical ambiguity for moral certainty. And you mistook institutional importance for permission." For the first time, anger cracked his composure. "Everything you learned about this profession came through this museum. Then the museum should be able to survive what I learned." He walked away before the donors could notice us arguing. At 7, Celia stepped toward the lectern to announce that authentication remained under review. Adrian intercepted her. I saw them exchange words behind the curtain. Then he walked onto the small platform and took the microphone. He began with the museum's history. He spoke about courage, scholarship, and the responsibility to protect culture from private interests. That phrase told me what was coming. He announced that questions had arisen because an estate claimant had challenged the works. He said the museum welcomed good faith review. Then he looked directly at me. "Unfortunately," he said, "Ms. Vale has distributed altered photographs and unsupported material claims while seeking control of works whose value has become apparent." Guests turned. Phones rose. He said my mother may have possessed the paintings, but possession was not authorship. He implied I had added identifying marks during unsupervised treatment. Finally, he called my evidence fabricated. That accusation was more reckless than anything we had expected. It attacked the court-preserved files, Naomi's preliminary work, and the museum's own lab results. It also made the dispute public in front of witnesses. I asked, without raising my voice, whether he would support an immediate demonstration of the physical findings. He laughed once. A gallery spectacle cannot replace scholarship. Security, please escort Ms. Vale out. The guard touched my elbow. Naomi looked at Celia. Celia's face had changed. Perhaps it was the phone's recording. Perhaps it was Martin's declaration waiting on her screen. Perhaps she finally saw that protecting Adrian had become more dangerous than confronting him. She nodded. The lights went out. Naomi began with the largest painting because its surface showed the clearest sequence. She explained that aged natural resin fluoresces under ultraviolet radiation, while newer coatings often appear dark. Her language remained exact and almost plain enough to miss the drama of it. The old varnish glowed green. Around the black signature, a dark rectangular island interrupted it. That showed the coating over the letters was newer than the surrounding surface. Then she moved the lamp. Fine pale lines emerged beneath the retouching. Part of an I, the curve of an S, and a diagonal blue pencil trace at the canvas key. The donors leaned closer. Naomi projected my baseline photograph beside the live image. The crack pattern matched. The blue mark matched. The area where J cross now appeared had been blank when I documented it. Adrian said the photograph could have been altered. Priya, standing near the back, stated that the source drive had been forensically imaged under seal, and its hash recorded before the museum produced its own files. Naomi added that one of Calder's internal server thumbnails, recovered from an automated backup, matched my baseline image. Adrian pivoted. He said I could have altered the painting after taking the photograph but before transferring it. Naomi showed the new varnish crossing the museum's own inventory label adhesive at one edge. The treatment had occurred after museum intake. He said Martin had performed legitimate restoration. Celia asked whether he had authorized reconstructed signatures. Adrian did not answer directly. He said all treatment decisions had been based on research and delegated through appropriate channels. Naomi projected the infrared image. There was no buried cross monogram. The red guide marks Martin described in his declaration had no basis in the object. Lucas stepped forward. His hands shook, but his voice did not. I tested a flake from the black inscription 5 months ago, he said. The binder was modern acrylic. Director Mercer ordered the report removed after the repeat test produced the same result. The raw instrument files remain in the system backup. Adrian stared at him. You were not authorized to interpret those results. I am authorized to report what the instrument recorded. That was when Ruth placed the accession records on a table beneath the projection. She explained the difference between a custody receipt, an accession worksheet, and a permanent accession card. She showed the genuine 1986 Vale loan record and the photocopy that changed one letter to create the fake Vale history. Then she showed the certified reading room entry describing my current temporary worksheet before the museum restricted access. The original worksheet recorded 12 works attributed to Isabel Vale, Ruth said. Mr. Mercer annotated it with her initials. Adrian claimed the initials could mean inventory verification. Ruth looked at him over her glasses. You wrote possible IV group beside the artist field. Registrars do not place inventory verification in an artist field. A few people laughed, then stopped when they realized none of this was funny. The final projection showed the linen supplier statement. The weave pattern did not exist until 1990. Julian Cross died in 1987. No theory of misplaced custody, reconstructed signatures, or unreliable memory could make him paint on fabric manufactured after his death. Adrian gripped the sides of the lectern. Attribution is cumulative, he said. No single test decides authorship. Naomi agreed. That surprised him. You are correct, she said. No single test establishes Isabel Vale's authorship. The conclusion rests on cumulative evidence. Dated ownership records, documented materials, correspondence showing prior knowledge of the works, baseline condition images, consistent working marks, supplier records, and the absence of any credible cross-provenance. The recent signatures do not support attribution. They demonstrate intervention. She did not call him a criminal. She did something more damaging to the authority he had built. She described exactly what the evidence could and could not prove, and the truth remained standing after every limit. Celia took the microphone from him. She announced that the exhibition was suspended, the expansion pledge would not be accepted pending review, and Adrian was placed on leave effective immediately. The board would appoint independent provenance counsel and notify donors, insurers, and relevant professional bodies. Adrian looked at me as if I had destroyed the museum. "You wanted this," he said. I thought of the moment he offered climate-controlled storage, the way Hope had made me trust him, and the months he spent preparing to call that trust evidence of my guilt. "I wanted you to stop," I said. "You chose the audience." Security did escort someone from the gallery that night. It was not me. The room did not erupt into applause. Donors spoke. Staff gathered in groups. One reporter asked whether I had planned the confrontation. I told her I had planned an examination. Adrian had planned the confrontation. Celia asked everyone to leave while the gallery was secured. Naomi supervised the removal of the UV equipment and resealing of the paintings. Priya reminded museum counsel that the preservation order remained in force. Lucas sat on a bench with both hands around a paper cup. Ruth corrected an inventory number on the temporary closure sheet, because even that night she would not allow a bad record to survive. I stood before the painting of the woman with the oranges until the lights came back on. Under ordinary illumination, the false signature looked solid again. That unsettled me. Truth had not transformed the surface permanently. It had required the right light, the right angle, and people willing to look. By midnight, clips from the preview were online. Headlines called it a scandal, a showdown, and a stunning revenge. None of those words described how I felt. I was relieved that the paintings were safe. I was afraid for Lucas. I was furious that my mother had been denied twice, first while alive and then after death. Mostly I was tired enough to feel hollow. The board hired outside counsel and an independent provenance panel within a week. They sealed Adrian's office, imaged museum servers, and reviewed 5 years of treatment contracts. Celia called to offer me reinstatement with pay, while the employment investigation continued. I asked whether I would report to the same management structure that suspended me. She said interim leadership was still being arranged. "Then I will remain on leave," I said. 11 months earlier, I would have accepted simply to prove I was loyal. Now I understood that returning quickly could help the museum advertise normality before it had earned it. The review lasted 4 months. During that time, every certainty was tested again. Naomi's laboratory repeated the pigment analysis with 2 independent facilities. Both found modern binder in the inscriptions. Textile specialists compared the linen weave with Varga's loom records. A paper conservator examined the fake 1986 card and found optical brighteners introduced after the supposed date. Digital examiners recovered draft label files from Adrian's laptop. The earliest called the paintings Isabel Vale Group. Later versions replaced her name with Circle of Cross, then attributed to Cross, and finally Julian Cross. The progression mattered. It showed the conclusion moving ahead of the evidence one profitable step at a time. Investigators recovered emails between Adrian and the lead donor. The donor had promised $28 million if the museum could establish itself as the principal Cross Research Center. Adrian wrote that a transformative discovery was imminent. That email predated the first scientific examination by 6 weeks. Another message to Martin described the signatures as necessary visual anchors for public confidence. Those 6 words ended any remaining claim that the alterations were neutral conservation. Adrian defended himself through counsel. He said his language was promotional shorthand, that treatment decisions had been delegated, and that he had believed the cross attribution in good faith. He accused the board of abandoning him to protect donors. He never contacted me directly. The truth was that Adrian understood. He had read my mother's letters. He had seen her marks. He had watched me carry the canvases into his museum. His failure was not a lack of information. It was a decision that his institution's ambition deserved more reality than her life did. You cannot explain someone out of a choice they made with full knowledge. Lucas kept his job under interim leadership, though staying was not easy. Some colleagues thanked him privately and avoided him publicly. Others blamed him for the cancelled expansion. One afternoon he came to the shop and apologized again for deleting the test PDF. I told myself the raw data still existed, he said. I thought that made it less dishonest. I poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. Why did you finally call? He looked at the old lettering samples on the wall. Adrian asked me to sign a statement saying you might have contaminated every sample before intake. I knew that wasn't possible. He wanted my name on it. So the line was your signature. He nodded. I did not tell him he had been brave from the beginning. He had not. Courage that costs nothing is an attractive story, but it would have taught him nothing. I told him that preserving the raw data mattered and that speaking before the preview mattered too. Then I asked what safeguards he wanted in the new lab policy. He proposed automatic offsite retention of raw instrument runs, 2-person approval before deleting reports, and direct ethics reporting outside the director's chain of command. The board adopted all 3. Ruth returned to the archive as a paid consultant. Her first demand was almost comically specific. No director could remove an accession document without a registrar recording a temporary movement slip. She also required audit logs for reclassification. People imagine archives are protected by locked doors, she told me. They are protected by making every movement leave a trace. Martin lost his Calder contracts. The professional association reviewed his conduct and required ethics retraining and supervised practice. Some people thought he deserved permanent expulsion. Others saw him as a scapegoat. I saw a man who had known an instruction was wrong enough to ask about it, then accepted reassurance because the payment and prestige were convenient. His declaration had helped expose Adrian. It did not erase his hands from the paintings. Accountability did not require deciding that every person was entirely villain or entirely victim. The donor who promised the Cross Center withdrew the pledge before the final report. He offered to redirect part of it toward a gallery named after my mother. I declined. That surprised Celia. Isabel deserves recognition, she said. She does. But putting her name on a room funded to repair this scandal would turn her into the museum's apology. Correct the records first. Count for the money. Build a provenance program that protects the next unknown artist. The donor eventually committed $6 million to an independently governed provenance and conservation fund. Its charter required public reporting, conflict disclosures, and support for researching works by artists without established markets. My mother's name appeared in the founding history, not above the door. The final board report was 78 pages. It concluded that the 12 paintings were created by Isabel Vale between 1993 and 2011. The panel based that finding on material chronology, supplier records, family photographs showing works in progress, correspondence, her distinctive underdrawing, and witness statements from former sign shop employees. It found no credible connection to Julian Cross. The report also concluded that Adrian knowingly advanced an unsupported attribution, authorized misleading surface alterations, suppressed contradictory testing, caused records to be removed or fabricated, and made false statements about my conduct. He resigned the morning before publication. His resignation letter said he had always acted in the museum's best interests and regretted that unconventional decisions had been misunderstood. There was no apology to my mother, Lucas, Ruth, the donors, or me. The board referred its findings to authorities and professional bodies. Investigations continued beyond the end of my story. I will not pretend there was a dramatic conviction or a prison door. Consequences moved through contracts, insurance claims, employment decisions, and reputation. Museums removed Adrian from advisory panels. A university canceled his guest lectures. 2 institutions began reviewing projects he had authenticated. For a man who built power by being trusted in quiet rooms, losing entry to those rooms was not a small consequence. The museum offered me a settlement. It included back pay, legal costs, a written correction, and reinstatement as senior conservator. The first draft contained a confidentiality clause and language saying neither side admitted wrongdoing. Priya slid it back across the table. The revised agreement acknowledged that the museum had suspended me based on inaccurate information supplied by former leadership. It preserved my right to discuss the attribution evidence and my mother's work. It also returned all 12 paintings to the estate after conservation stabilization funded by the museum. I accepted the financial terms and declined reinstatement. Celia asked me to reconsider. She said change required good people inside institutions. Sometimes, I said. And sometimes an institution asks the person it harmed to prove its reform by coming back. I did agree to serve for 1 year on the Independent Provenance Fund's Public Advisory Group, with a written conflict policy and no authority over my mother's paintings. That boundary let me contribute without becoming Calder's redemption story. When the paintings returned to the sign shop, they arrived in climate-controlled crates with condition reports thicker than anything my mother would have tolerated. Naomi supervised unpacking. The false signatures had not yet been removed because the panel wanted a full treatment proposal and my approval as owner. For several days I left them visible. I needed to decide whether removing the signatures would erase evidence or restore the paintings. Naomi explained that the added black paint sat above an isolating layer. It could be reduced safely while preserving microscopic samples and complete documentation.
Y chose removal.
We treated one painting at a time in Naomi's laboratory. The black letters lifted slowly, while the original surfaces remained protected beneath the isolating layer. I watched as owner, not conservator. Independence still mattered after victory. Under the fourth signature, we found a tiny red line from my mother's underdrawing, an abandoned edge of a suitcase. That unnecessary, authentic hesitation returned her from the report to the room. When treatment ended, we faced another question. Where should the paintings be shown? Offers arrived from major museums. A London gallery proposed a commercial exhibition with prices that made me reread the email. A streaming company wanted adaptation rights to the scandal. A publisher suggested a memoir before I had even slept properly. I rejected anything that made Adrian the center of my mother's introduction to the world. Instead, I rented a former print shop 2 blocks from the bus station. It had white walls, uneven floors, and front windows that filled with morning light. The owner gave me 6 weeks at a reduced rate because his father remembered Isabel painting the sign above his first store. We called the exhibition Between Departures, Paintings by Isabel Vale. No title mentioned fraud, cross, or revenge. I selected 8 of the 12 works so the room could breathe. Beside them, I displayed small photographs of my mother's sign work. Gold letters on a bakery window, blue script on a florist's van, a crooked birthday banner she had repainted because one hour bothered her. Visitors could see that her commercial hand and painting hand belonged to the same life. The wall text described evidence without turning the show into a courtroom. One panel explained the blue pencil marks and why humble records matter. Another acknowledged the false attribution and conservation treatment in 3 clear paragraphs. We did not hide what happened, but we refused to let it consume every painting. Lucas helped calibrate the environmental monitors. Ruth checked the object list twice. Naomi approved the hanging conditions. Priya insisted we increase insurance. My Aunt Sophia brought pastries and complained that the labels made Isabel sound too serious. She once painted a mustache on your school portrait, Sophia reminded me. So I added 1 sentence to the biography. Isabel distrusted solemn people and corrected them with jokes. On opening morning, I arrived before anyone else. Rain had stopped during the night. Across the street, buses moved in and out of the station, their brakes sighing against the curb. I turned on the lights, then turned them off again. The natural light was enough. The first label was plain black text on whiteboard. It read,
Isabel Vale.
Woman with Oranges, 1998. Oil on Belgian linen. There was no famous man's name above hers. No cautious phrase like circle of or attributed to. No explanation asking permission for her to be there. At 10 the doors opened. The first visitor was the nurse my mother had painted asleep on a suitcase. She was retired now. Her daughter had recognized the image in a newspaper and driven her 3 hours to see it. She stood before the painting for a long time. I remember your mother, she said. She woke me before my bus. That witness had no value to the attribution panel. The painting was completed years after Cross's death, and material evidence was already decisive. But the nurse remembered my mother noticing her. Recognition moved in both directions. More people came. Former sign shop customers, conservation students, donors from Calder, travelers waiting for delayed buses, and neighbors who had never entered a museum. Some wanted details about Adrian. Most stayed longer with the paintings than with the scandal panel. Celia attended alone. She did not ask for photographs. She apologized without mentioning legal language. I protected the institution until I could no longer tell the difference between the institution and the man leading it, she said. I believed her. Belief did not restore trust automatically. What will you do differently before the next crisis? I asked. She listed the reforms: independent reporting, registrar authority, treatment consent, donor firewalls, and public provenance files. Then she said the harder change was teaching trustees that embarrassment survived better than concealment. That is the beginning, I told her. We did not embrace. Some apologies deserve acknowledgement before they deserve closeness. Near closing time, a young woman in a museum studies program asked whether exposing Adrian had felt like revenge. I looked at the room, at my mother's name, at Lucas explaining a humidity monitor to a child, at Ruth checking that a visitor had not leaned a wet umbrella against the wall. For one night, maybe, I said. After that, it felt like maintenance. She seemed disappointed by the answer, but it was true. Justice had been made from unglamorous acts. Preserving a drive, recording a sample, signing an archive log, refusing a false clause, checking a weave pattern, and waiting for independent people to do work I desperately wanted to control. Adrian had relied on everyone, preferring a beautiful announcement to an inconvenient record. We defeated him by keeping the record. The exhibition ran for 6 weeks. We sold catalogs at cost and donated the final week's receipts to a legal fund for artists contesting false attribution and ownership claims. I now run a conservation practice in the front half of the old sign shop. The back room remains a studio. My mother's brushes hang above mine, though I use different paint and make different mistakes. On the wall beside the sink is a framed copy of the temporary custody receipt that began the case. People assume I framed it as a warning. Partly I did. It reminds me that a proper form can be ignored by powerful people, and that keeping your copy matters. But I also framed my mother's final letter. The line I read most often is not her refusal to wait for the museum. It is the one about what she wanted me to learn. Permission is not the same as worth. For years, I thought loyalty meant enduring discomfort until the person above me recognized my patience. Adrian understood that and used it. My mother had understood the danger long before I did. She would rather keep her work unseen than let an institution teach me to confuse access with value. The irony is that her paintings became visible only after someone tried to give them a more profitable name. I cannot change that. I can decide what remains after the scandal fades. The original accession card is back in Calder's archive, digitized with a public history of every alteration. The fake card is preserved beside it as evidence. The museum's database names Isabel as artist and the Vale estate as former owner. When I speak to conservation interns, I show them 2 nearly identical photographs and the paper trail that makes their difference meaningful. Ultraviolet light revealed layers. People revealed choices. Lucas chose to preserve raw data. Ruth chose to make her search traceable. Martin eventually chose to name the instruction he had followed. Naomi chose precision when certainty would have made better theater. Celia chose action too late to prevent harm but early enough to stop the sale of a lie. I chose to stop asking my mentor for permission to believe my own records. Adrian chose to. Again and again. That is why the ending does not depend on whether he ever apologizes. On the final evening of my mother's exhibition, I waited until every visitor had left. I checked the windows, lowered the shades, and stood before Woman with Oranges. The cleaned corner held no signature. My mother rarely signed the front of her paintings. She said a name could become a shortcut that kept people from looking. For the catalog, we had reproduced her blue pencil mark from the back of the canvas. A small diagonal line forked where it caught the grain. It was never meant for an audience. It was simply how she kept track of what belonged to her. I switched off the gallery lights. This time, nothing hidden needed to glow. Morning traffic moved beyond the shades, and my mother's name remained on the wall in the first gray light of day.